The darkness that fell over London on the night of September 7, 1940, was unlike any that had come before. As the air raid sirens wailed their mournful warning across the city, ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, factory workers, school children, and mothers hurried toward shelter with practiced urgency, but still unaware that this night would mark the beginning of a terror campaign unlike anything in modern warfare. What awaited them was not merely another bombing raid, but the commencement of the systematic aerial bombardment of a civilian population, the Blitz, a terrifying new chapter in the Battle of Britain that would test the limits of human endurance and redefine the very concept of courage. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The first wave came at precisely 5:30 p.m. as the evening light was fading. 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, appeared in the skies over London. Their drone grew from a distant hum to a terrifying roar as they approached their target, not military installations or strategic defenses, but the densely populated East End of London, home to the city's docklands and working-class neighborhoods. The decision to deliberately target civilian areas represented a fundamental shift in Luftwaffe strategy, ordered personally by Adolf Hitler as retaliation for British bombing of Berlin several nights earlier. Below, Londoners who had grown accustomed to the threat of air raids over the summer months of 1940 were about to face an entirely new scale of attack. The distinctive crump of bombs began to punctuate the evening, at first scattered, then building to a horrifying crescendo as hundreds of high explosives rained down on the city's eastern districts. The London docks were hit almost immediately, and fires began to spread with alarming speed as warehouses filled with timber and combustible goods ignited. Ada Wilson, a 32-year-old seamstress from Stepney, later recalled the moment the attacks began. "We'd had alerts before, but this was different. The noise was constant, like the world was ending. I grabbed my gas mask and emergency bag, we all had them ready by then, and ran for the Anderson shelter in the garden with my mother and 2 children. We could hear the bombs falling closer and closer. The ground shook with each explosion. My little girl, only 6, kept asking if we were going to die. What could I say to her? I just held her tight and told her to count the seconds between the explosions like it was a game. By nightfall, the eastern horizon of London had transformed into an apocalyptic vision of hell on earth. The docks were an inferno, sending towering flames hundreds of feet into the air. The glow could be seen for miles around, inadvertently providing a perfect beacon for the second wave of German bombers that arrived after dark. This nocturnal bombardment would continue for nearly 9 hours until 4:30 a.m. the following morning. More than 1,500 civilians would lose their lives in this first terrible night of what would become known as the Blitz. The strategy behind this attack was coldly calculated. By targeting civilian population centers, the Nazi leadership hoped to break the British will to fight. Air Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that the Royal Air Force was on the verge of collapse after months of aerial combat in the Battle of Britain. Unable to achieve air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, the Germans shifted to a terror campaign designed to force British capitulation through civilian suffering. The roots of this strategy lay in the evolving doctrine of aerial warfare. Throughout the 1930s, military theorists like Italian General Giulio Douhet had argued that the bomber had changed warfare forever. In his influential work, The Command of the Air, Douhet suggested that future wars would be won by destroying enemy morale through bombing civilian targets, making traditional battlefield victories obsolete. The Spanish Civil War, particularly the bombing of Guernica in 1937, had provided a terrifying preview of this approach. Now London was to be the laboratory for testing these theories on an unprecedented scale. For the average Londoner, the immediate reality was far removed from such strategic calculations. Their world had suddenly contracted to the most basic concerns of survival: where to find shelter, how to protect loved ones, whether their homes would still be standing by morning. The infrastructure of civilian defense had been developing since before the war began, but nothing could fully prepare a modern city for the onslaught that now descended upon it. The primary shelter for many families was the Anderson Shelter, named after Sir John Anderson, the Home Secretary who had overseen their distribution. These corrugated steel structures, partially buried in gardens and covered with earth, could protect a family from all but direct hits. By September 1940, nearly 2.5 million had been distributed to households across Britain. For those without gardens, public shelters had been constructed, while London's underground stations would soon become impromptu refuges for thousands seeking safety beneath the city streets. Fred Haynes, a 41-year-old dock worker, spent that first night of the Blitz in a public shelter near the West India docks. It was packed to bursting, he later wrote in his diary. People sitting shoulder to shoulder on benches, children sleeping on blankets on the floor. You could feel the building shake with every nearby explosion. The noise was terrible. The bombs, the anti-aircraft guns, the occasional crash as something nearby collapsed. But the strangest thing was how people behaved. There was fear, of course, but also this remarkable calm. Someone started singing at one point, and others joined in. An old woman shared out cups of tea from a flask. It sounds impossible now, but there were even moments of laughter. This stoicism in the face of terror would become one of the defining characteristics of London's response to the Blitz. It wasn't that fear was absent. Interview transcripts from the Mass Observation Social Research Organization reveal the profound anxiety that gripped many Londoners, but rather that a collective determination quickly emerged not to allow that fear to translate into panic or defeatism. As dawn broke on September 8th, Londoners emerged from shelters to find a transformed cityscape. The East End had taken the brunt of the attack, with entire streets reduced to rubble. The London docks were still burning, sending plumes of thick black smoke across the city. Emergency services, stretched far beyond their capacity, worked frantically to extinguish fires, rescue those trapped in collapsed buildings, and tend to the injured. Thousands found themselves suddenly homeless, carrying what few possessions they had managed to salvage from the ruins. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth made a point of visiting the East End that very day, a gesture that would be repeated throughout the Blitz. When Buckingham Palace itself was bombed on September 13th, the Queen famously remarked, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." This royal solidarity with the suffering of ordinary citizens helped cement the narrative of shared national sacrifice that would become so central to British wartime identity. Prime Minister Winston Churchill also toured the bombed areas, his presence providing a visible symbol of government resolve. In a speech to the House of Commons on September 11th, he gave voice to the nation's defiance. These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes, by killing large numbers of civilians and women and children, that he will terrorize and cow the people of this mighty imperial city. Little does he know the spirit of the British nation. The rhetoric of leadership thus aligned perfectly with the emerging popular narrative of stoic endurance. Behind this public face of resolute courage, however, the authorities had grave concerns. Secret government reports from the first weeks of the Blitz reveal anxieties about how long civilian morale could withstand such punishment. There were fears that continued heavy casualties might lead to demands for negotiated peace. The Home Intelligence Division monitored public opinion closely, and their reports noted increasing anger among East Enders who felt they were bearing a disproportionate burden of the bombing campaign, while wealthier areas remained relatively unscathed. The class dimensions of the early Blitz experience were indeed stark. The East End, with its docklands, factories, and densely packed working-class housing, suffered far more devastation than the affluent West End and suburbs. This inequality was exacerbated by differential access to effective shelter. While wealthy families might retreat to country homes or hotel shelters with proper amenities, many East Enders initially had only inadequate public shelters or the underground, which the government had initially been reluctant to open for shelter purposes. Doris Melling, a munitions factory worker from Poplar, expressed this sentiment in a letter to her sister in Wales. They talk about, "We're all in it together, but that's not how it feels when you see how the other half live. Our entire street was flattened last night. The Johnsons lost their twin boys, only 8 years old they were. Meanwhile, the rich folks drive off to their country houses. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we should give up. Hitler's not going to beat us. But don't tell me this war's hitting everyone the same." The government, recognizing these tensions, moved quickly to address some of the most glaring inequalities in civil defense. The underground stations were officially opened as shelters, tube station policy was standardized, and efforts were made to improve conditions with bunks, canteens, and medical facilities. Mobile canteens, operated by the Women's Voluntary Service, brought hot meals to bombed-out areas, while rest centers were established to provide temporary accommodation for those rendered homeless. The Blitz brought about a significant expansion of the state's role in civilian welfare, presaging some of the post-war welfare state developments. As September progressed, the pattern of the Blitz became established. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights, with attacks generally beginning after nightfall and continuing until dawn. The Luftwaffe would drop high explosive bombs to damage buildings and infrastructure, followed by incendiary devices designed to start fires. These tactics were refined over time, with delayed action bombs being introduced to hinder the work of rescue services. The German bombardment was not limited to London. Beginning in November, other major cities and industrial centers became targets in what became known as the Provincial Blitz. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, Southampton, Plymouth, and other cities all suffered severe attacks. The raid on Coventry on November 14, 1940, was particularly devastating, destroying much of the city center, including the medieval cathedral. The word "Coventrated" briefly entered the German military lexicon as a term for the utter destruction of a city. For civilians in these targeted cities, the experience of the Blitz forced a complete reorganization of daily life. Sleep patterns were dictated by the rhythm of air raids, with many people developing the ability to function on fragmented rest. Work continued despite the bombing, with factory shifts, office hours, and essential services maintained even after sleepless nights in shelters. The simple act of shopping for food became a logistical challenge as familiar streets became unrecognizable landscapes of rubble, while shops and markets operated erratically based on delivery schedules disrupted by bomb damage. Children's lives were particularly disrupted. Though nearly 1.5 million children had been evacuated from urban areas at the outbreak of war in September 1939, many had returned home during the relatively quiet period of the phony war. The commencement of the Blitz prompted a second wave of evacuations, though significant numbers remained in the cities, either because their parents were unwilling to part with them, or because the children themselves had returned, homesick for their families. For these urban children, education became irregular as schools were damaged or repurposed for civil defense, while play took place in the surreal landscape of bomb sites and rubble. Elsie Chamberlain, a teacher in Bermondsey, recorded her observations of children during this period. The resilience of these youngsters is remarkable. They've developed games around the bombing, competing to collect shrapnel fragments, incorporating air raid wardens and firefighters into their play. They can identify different aircraft by their engine sounds and have an entire vocabulary around the different types of bombs. There's a part of me that marvels at their adaptability, but it breaks my heart to see how normal this abnormal existence has become for them. 10-year-olds should not be experts on explosive devices. The psychological impact of the Blitz varied widely among individuals. Contemporary studies by psychiatrists anticipated mass breakdowns and widespread shell shock similar to that observed in soldiers during the First World War. In practice, such severe reactions were less common than expected, though more subtle psychological effects were pervasive. Many experienced heightened anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a form of emotional numbing that psychiatrists later identified as an adaptive response to continuous threat. Children showed increased rates of bedwetting, nightmares, and nervous habits, though the feared epidemic of juvenile delinquency largely failed to materialize. This relative psychological resilience became an important part of the Blitz narrative, both at the time and in subsequent historical memory. It aligned perfectly with the desired national self-image of British phlegm and carrying on in the face of adversity. The slogan "Keep Calm and Carry On," though printed on posters in 1939, was never officially distributed during the war, but has since become emblematic of this perceived national characteristic. Yet historical research has increasingly questioned the uniformity of this stoic response. The mass observation archives reveal a more complex picture, with many respondents reporting intense fear, depression, and anger alongside determination. Incidents of looting occurred after major raids, though they were downplayed in contemporary reporting. Alcohol consumption increased, and absenteeism from work spiked following particularly severe bombing nights. Some air raid shelters saw outbreaks of shelter panic, especially early in the Blitz, before routines had been established. Certain communities faced unique challenges during this period. London's East End had significant Jewish and immigrant populations who worried not only about the bombs, but about the possibility of a Nazi invasion and the fate that might await them if Britain fell. Black and Asian communities sometimes encountered discrimination in public shelters and evacuation schemes. For these Londoners, the war against fascism had particularly personal dimensions. The physical transformation of the urban landscape was profound. Historic buildings and landmarks disappeared overnight. St. Paul's Cathedral, standing miraculously intact amid the devastation of the City of London after the particularly severe raid of December 29, 1940, became an iconic symbol of national endurance. The photograph of its dome rising above the smoke was reproduced worldwide as a powerful image of Britain's survival. Meanwhile, bomb sites created surreal gaps in once familiar streets, sometimes revealing the interior walls of damaged buildings like dollhouses opened up for inspection, exposing the intimate details of strangers' living spaces, wallpaper patterns, family photographs still hanging askew, furniture half buried in debris. The natural environment also responded to the disruption in unexpected ways. Bomb craters filled with water became impromptu ponds quickly colonized by aquatic life. Wildflowers, particularly rosebay willow herb, dubbed bombweed by Londoners, spread rapidly across bomb sites, creating splashes of purple amid the gray devastation. These small signs of natural resilience and renewal became meaningful to many civilians enduring the attacks, symbolic reminders that life would continue despite the destruction. For the fire services, the Blitz represented an unprecedented challenge. The pre-war auxiliary fire service had expanded rapidly, with volunteers and newly trained recruits joining the regular firefighters. They faced not only the danger of the fires themselves, but also the risk of being caught in ongoing raids while performing their duties. Water supplies were often compromised by bomb damage to mains, forcing creative solutions such as the use of the Thames at low tide, the creation of emergency water tanks in parks and squares, and even the construction of a 6-mile pipeline from Surrey to provide London's firefighters with water when local supplies failed. Sub-Officer James Ellis of the London Fire Brigade later described the scene at the Surrey Commercial Docks fire on September 7th. The heat was so intense, it felt like your face was melting. We were trying to establish a water relay from the river, but bombs kept falling around us. sending up geysers of water and debris. Every time we got a line established, something would happen. A direct hit on the pump, a section of hose ruptured by shrapnel, a crew member injured and needing to be evacuated. The worst part was knowing that while we were tied up with the docks blazing, there were dozens of other fires we couldn't get to, homes burning, people trapped. You just had to focus on what was in front of you and trust that someone else was handling the rest, though God knows there weren't enough of us to go around. The medical services also evolved rapidly to meet the crisis. Hospitals developed specialized approaches to dealing with air raid casualties, with triage systems to sort the wounded according to the severity of their injuries. Blood transfusion services expanded dramatically, with a national blood bank system developing from wartime necessity. Mobile first aid posts treated minor injuries, while emergency ambulance services transported the more seriously wounded. Medical personnel themselves often worked under bombing, with surgery sometimes continuing during air raids in hospital basements or reinforced operating theaters. By the end of 1940, the pattern of life under bombardment had achieved a kind of terrible normality. Routines had developed around the rhythm of alerts and all clears. Underground stations had evolved into organized subterranean communities, with regular shelters claiming particular spots each night, impromptu entertainment committees organizing sing-alongs and performances, and even shelter marshals enforcing rules about noise and hygiene. Above ground, restaurants and theaters continued to operate, though with adjusted hours to account for the blackout and the likely timing of raids. This adaptation to life under bombardment became a source of pride and a form of resistance in itself. The notion that ordinary life could continue despite Hitler's best efforts to disrupt it became central to civilian morale. Newspaper photographs showing milkmen delivering on bicycles through rubble-strewn streets, typists working at desks positioned near windows blown out in the previous night's raid, or couples getting married amid the ruins of bombed churches reinforced the narrative of British determination and adaptability. The experience of the Blitz intensified through the winter months of 1940-41. The raid of December 29, 1940, targeting the city of London, became known as the Second Great Fire of London, with the area around St. Paul's Cathedral devastated by incendiary bombs. The fire services, stretched beyond capacity, made the difficult decision to focus on saving St. Paul's as a symbol of national continuity, allowing many surrounding buildings to burn. The survival of the cathedral amid such destruction took on almost mythical significance in the public imagination. The heaviest single raid on London occurred on May 10, 1941. Nearly 700 German bombers dropped over 10,000 incendiary bombs and 700 tons of high explosives in what would later be called the longest night. More than 1,400 civilians were killed and tens of thousands were left homeless. The House of Commons was hit, as were numerous historic buildings and 14 hospitals. The symbolism of targeting the very heart of British democracy was not lost on either side. Yet even as this devastating raid was taking place, the strategic priorities of Nazi Germany were shifting. The impending invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, meant that Luftwaffe resources would soon be redeployed to the Eastern Front. The raid of May 10-11 proved to be the last major attack of the main Blitz period, though smaller-scale raids would continue sporadically throughout the war, and new threats such as the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets would emerge in the war's final years. For the civilians who had endured these 9 months of intensive bombing, the sudden relative quiet was almost disorienting. They had adapted to a way of life organized around the expectation of nightly raids, developing psychological and practical routines to manage the constant threat. The Blitz had forced a radical reorganization of British society, accelerating changes in gender roles, class relations, and the relationship between citizens and the state. These transformations would continue to shape British life long after the bombing had ceased. As spring turned to summer in 1941, the physical reconstruction of bombed areas began in earnest, though with the understanding that the war was far from over. Temporary prefabricated structures replaced destroyed homes and businesses, while longer-term planning for post-war reconstruction became a subject of increasing public discussion. The very destruction wrought by the bombs created an opportunity to reimagine urban spaces, with planners like Patrick Abercrombie developing visions of modernized cities rising from the rubble. The human cost of the Blitz was immense. Approximately 43,000 civilians were killed across Britain during the bombing campaigns, with hundreds of thousands injured. Millions experienced property damage, temporary or permanent homelessness, bereavement, and trauma. Yet the feared collapse of civilian morale, the primary strategic objective of the bombing campaign, had failed to materialize. If anything, the shared experience of enduring the Blitz had strengthened national cohesion and resolve. This outcome represented a profound miscalculation on the part of Nazi leadership. They had believed that targeting civilian populations would create irresistible pressure for surrender. Instead, the bombing galvanized British determination to continue the fight. Luftwaffe intelligence had failed to understand how the experience of collective suffering might strengthen rather than undermine social solidarity. This miscalculation would be repeated by Allied planners later in the war, when strategic bombing of German cities similarly failed to break civilian morale. For the men and women who lived through the Blitz, the memory of that time would remain vivid throughout their lives. Certain sensory experiences became indelibly associated with the period. The distinctive wail of the air raid sirens, the peculiar silence that sometimes fell between waves of bombers, the smell of cordite and dust that hung over bombed areas, the eerily beautiful sight of barrage balloons silvered by moonlight floating above the city like strange guardians. Rose Wilson, who had been a teenage munitions worker during the Blitz, reflected 50 years later. People ask if we were frightened, and of course we were. Anyone who says they weren't is either lying or doesn't remember properly, but fear wasn't the only thing we felt. There was this strange exhilaration sometimes, a feeling that you were truly alive because each day might be your last. And there was something else too, something I've never quite been able to explain, this sense that we were all in it together, all part of something bigger than ourselves. I've never felt that kind of connection to strangers before or since. For all the terror and loss, there was something almost transcendent about that time. As the Blitz continued through the winter of 1940-41, the nature of civilian response evolved in ways that would have lasting implications for British society. The initial shock gave way to a complex adaptive resilience that manifested differently across social classes, neighborhoods, and individuals. What emerged was not a uniform Blitz spirit, as later mythologized, but rather a multifaceted response shaped by pre-existing social structures and the specific circumstances of the bombing campaign. For those in the heavily targeted working-class districts, the immediate aftermath of bombing brought practical challenges that demanded immediate solutions. The morning after a raid would see streets filled with rescue workers digging through rubble, utility crews attempting to restore water and electricity, and ordinary citizens salvaging possessions from damaged homes. The Women's Voluntary Service, WVS, established before the war but expanded dramatically during the Blitz, became a crucial element in this immediate response. Their mobile canteens provided hot meals and tea to both rescue workers and bombing victims, while their clothing exchanges helped outfit those who had lost everything in the raids. Vera Brittain, the novelist and pacifist who served with the WVS, wrote in her diary in December 1940, "The resilience of these women who have lost everything is humbling." A mother who had been pulled from the wreckage of her home only hours before, her face still coated with brick dust, was helping distribute tea to the rescue workers digging for her neighbors. When I commented on her strength, she simply replied, "Well, my dear, what else is there to do? Give up." That's not our way. This pragmatic adaptation became characteristic of civilian response. Bombing created an immediate set of problems: shelter, food, warmth, clothing, that required practical rather than philosophical solutions. In addressing these needs, communities often demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Communal cooking arrangements emerged in neighborhoods where gas mains had been destroyed. Informal childcare networks developed, allowing parents to work in essential industries while ensuring children were supervised. Clothing exchanges and furniture pools helped redistribute salvaged items to those most in need. The breakdown of normal routines and structures also created unexpected spaces for social innovation. Tom Harrison, one of the founders of the Mass Observation Project that documented civilian experiences during the war, noted that the disruption caused by bombing sometimes broke down rigid pre-war social barriers. In public shelters and underground stations, people from different classes and backgrounds found themselves sharing close quarters, often developing forms of mutual aid and community that would have been unlikely in normal circumstances. The underground shelters became particularly significant sites of social reorganization. Though initially reluctant to permit their use as shelters, the government eventually embraced the tube stations as a key element of civil defense. By mid-September 1940, over 150,000 Londoners were sheltering in underground stations each night. These subterranean communities developed their own cultures and organizational structures, with regular shelters claiming particular spots and establishing informal rules and customs. Joan Adams, who sheltered regularly at Liverpool Street Station, described this evolving community. After a few weeks, it was like a strange sort of village down there. Everyone knew which family sat where. Mrs. Greenberg from the bakery always brought extra bread to share. Old Mr. Wilkins appointed himself air raid warden of our little corner, making sure everyone had water and checking on the elderly. Someone would start a song, and soon half the platform would join in. The most remarkable thing was that these were people who might never have spoken to each other above ground. But down there, with the bombs falling overhead, none of that seemed to matter anymore. These shelter communities were not without tensions. Early reports noted problems with sanitation, noise, and petty theft. Class and racial frictions occasionally surfaced, particularly in the early chaotic phase of shelter organization. Yet over time, many shelter communities developed sophisticated self-governance systems, with elected shelter marshals, entertainment committees, and rotas for cleaning and maintenance. Some even produced their own newsletters, documenting this unique subterranean society. Government officials, initially concerned about the potential for panic or social breakdown in these crowded underground spaces, were generally impressed by the self-organization that emerged. A Home Intelligence report from November 1940 noted, "The shelter communities represent a remarkable example of spontaneous social order arising from necessity. Far from requiring extensive external management, these groups have largely regulated themselves, developing practices and norms appropriate to their circumstances with minimal official intervention." For children, the Blitz created a particularly complex set of circumstances. Those who remained in the cities rather than being evacuated found their lives fundamentally altered. Schools operated erratically, with classes held in shifts or relocated to improvised spaces when buildings were damaged. Teachers incorporated air raid drills into daily routines, and lessons often continued in shelters during alerts. The educator and psychologist Susan Isaacs, observing children during this period, noted their remarkable adaptability, but also the subtle signs of strain, increased sensitivity to loud noises, sleep disturbances, and a tendency to incorporate themes of destruction and rescue into play. The bombing created a paradoxical situation for urban children. On one hand, they faced genuine dangers and witnessed traumatic scenes of destruction and death. On the other, the disruption of normal supervision and the transformation of the urban landscape created unprecedented freedom and adventure. Bomb sites became impromptu playgrounds, with children collecting shrapnel as trophies and incorporating air raids into their games. The novelist Graham Greene, walking through the East End in early 1941, observed children playing an elaborate game they called Rescue Squad amid the ruins of what had once been a row of terraced houses. Education authorities and child psychologists debated how to address the potential psychological impact of these experiences. The emerging field of child psychology, influenced by figures like Anna Freud, who was then working in London, advocated approaches that acknowledged children's fears while providing stability and opportunities to process experiences through play and creative expression. Schools incorporated discussions of bombing and civil defense into curricula, attempting to give children a sense of agency and understanding in circumstances largely beyond their control. For adults, the psychological impact of the Blitz varied widely based on individual temperament, social support networks, and personal circumstances. Contrary to pre-war expectations of mass psychiatric casualties, clinics established to treat air raid neurosis found themselves with fewer patients than anticipated. The psychiatrist Aubrey Lewis, working at the Maudsley Hospital, suggested that the concrete external nature of the threat actually resulted in less psychological distress than anticipated. When danger is shared, visible, and comprehensible, many individuals demonstrate remarkable resilience. It is often the invisible, uncertain threats that generate the most debilitating anxiety. This is not to suggest that the Blitz did not exact a psychological toll. Many experienced what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress: intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and sleep disturbances. Contemporary accounts describe the phenomenon of bomb anxiety, a state of nervous anticipation that affected even those who maintained outward composure. The diarist Vera Hodgson wrote in February 1941, "The sirens went again tonight, and I felt the familiar sensation, that sudden hollowness in the stomach, the dry mouth, the sharpening of all the senses. Even after all these months, the body reacts before the mind can assert control. We've learned to hide these reactions, but I wonder how many of us, beneath our calm exteriors, experience the same visceral response." For those who suffered direct losses, bereavement, serious injury, or the destruction of homes, the psychological impact was naturally more pronounced. The government established citizens' advice bureaus to help bombing victims navigate the practical aspects of disaster recovery, but the emotional support infrastructure was less developed. Religious institutions, community organizations, and informal support networks often filled this gap, providing spaces for grief and processing traumatic experiences. Certain occupations placed individuals at particular psychological risk. Rescue workers and medical personnel, repeatedly exposed to scenes of death and suffering, reported symptoms similar to what would now be called compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. The psychologist Thomas Rees, studying civil defense workers in 1941, noted, "These individuals exhibit a pattern of emotional distancing that serves as a protective mechanism, allowing them to function amid circumstances that would otherwise be emotionally overwhelming. However, this adaptation comes at a cost, with many reporting difficulties in reconnecting emotionally with family and friends during off-duty hours. The experience of waiting for loved ones to return home during raids created its own distinctive anxiety. Women whose husbands served in civil defense roles, firefighting, rescue services, or ARP, air raid precautions, faced particular strain. Gladys Morris, whose husband worked as a heavy rescue worker in Bermondsey, recalled, "The waiting was the worst part. Knowing he was out there, possibly digging through dangerous, unstable buildings while the bombs were still falling. I'd pace the shelter, trying not to let the children see my fear. Sometimes his shift would end at 8 a.m., but he wouldn't make it home until afternoon because they'd found someone trapped and wouldn't leave them." I aged years during those months. Religious faith provided a significant coping mechanism for many civilians. Churches, synagogues, and other places of worship adapted their services to accommodate the realities of air raids, with some holding shortened raid-proof services designed to conclude within the typical warning time between sirens and bombing. Others moved services to shelter areas or basements. Religious leaders reported increased attendance during the Blitz, though there were also accounts of crises of faith among those struggling to reconcile their religious beliefs with the suffering they witnessed. The Reverend John Collins, who served as an assistant curate in the heavily bombed district of Stepney, wrote to his bishop in January 1941, "The theological questions posed by parishioners have taken on a new urgency. They do not ask in academic terms about the problem of evil, but with raw immediacy, why would God allow this to happen to us? I find myself moving away from theological abstractions toward a theology of presence. What seems to matter most is not perfect answers, but being alongside people in their suffering, bearing witness to both their pain and their remarkable courage." For London's diverse communities, the Blitz experience had particular dimensions. The East End's Jewish population, already concerned about the rise of fascism before the war, faced the bombing with the additional awareness of what German occupation would mean for them specifically. Many had relatives in continental Europe and were beginning to hear troubling, if still incomplete, reports about the treatment of Jews in Nazi-occupied territories. This community's sheltering patterns often reflected these concerns, with some Jewish organizations establishing their own shelter arrangements where religious practices could be maintained. The city's smaller Black and Asian communities sometimes encountered discrimination in evacuation schemes and public shelters, though the shared experience of bombing also created instances of increased solidarity across racial lines. Colonial subjects from the West Indies, India, and Africa who had come to Britain found themselves unexpectedly on the front lines of a European war, their experiences rarely recorded in official histories, but preserved in personal accounts and community archives. Sam King, who had come from Jamaica to join the Royal Air Force and was stationed near London during the Blitz, later recalled, "The bombs didn't discriminate by color. In the shelters, we were all just people trying to survive the night. There were still some who looked at you sideways, but mostly there was a sense that we were all in it together. It changed something in how people saw each other, at least for a time." As 1941 progressed, the fabric of everyday life under bombardment acquired a kind of terrible normality. Businesses adapted to operating with damaged premises, reduced staff, and irregular customer patterns. Pubs, which played a crucial role in maintaining morale, might serve drinks amid shattered windows, with signs cheerfully proclaiming "more open than usual" after being damaged. Theaters and cinemas continued to operate, though with adjusted hours to account for the blackout and the likely timing of raids. Some installed beds in the basements so performers and audience members could remain if raids began during shows. Workers in essential industries maintained production despite the bombing, often sleeping at their workplaces during intense raids. Factories instituted fire watch systems, with employees taking turns monitoring for incendiary bombs, which could be extinguished if caught early. The workforce itself was transforming, with women entering industries previously dominated by men. By early 1941, women constituted nearly 40% of the industrial labor force, a dramatic shift from pre-war patterns that would have lasting implications for gender roles and expectations. The material conditions of life were significantly altered by the bombing campaign. Rationing, already in place for food items before the Blitz began, was extended to clothing in June 1941, with each person allocated 66 coupons per year. A man's suit required 26 coupons, a woman's dress 11. The Make Do and Mend campaign encouraged the repurposing and repair of existing clothing, while the utility scheme standardized clothing production to conserve materials and labor. These measures were accepted as necessary contributions to the war effort, though not without occasional grumbling about quality and style. Housing presented a particularly acute challenge. By the end of May 1941, approximately 1.4 million Londoners had been made homeless for at least a short period, with tens of thousands facing long-term displacement. The government requisitioned empty properties, converted non-residential buildings into temporary housing, and began constructing prefabricated temporary homes, known as prefabs. For those whose homes had suffered minor to moderate damage, emergency repairs might render them habitable, if not comfortable. Families often lived with tarpaulins, replacing sections of roof or plywood, covering blown-out windows for extended periods. Olive Jenkins, a 29-year-old telephone operator from Lewisham, described her family's living arrangements in a letter to her evacuated sister. "We're still in the house, though you'd hardly recognize it. The back bedroom's open to the sky now, so we've moved everything into the front room. Dad's rigged a tarpaulin over the worst of it, but when it rains heavily, we're still putting out buckets. Mrs. Reynolds next door wasn't so lucky. Direct hit, nothing left. So she's sharing with us now. 6 of us in 2 rooms, and the toilet's in the garden since the plumbing's gone. But we're alive and together, which is more than some can say." The shared experience of the Blitz began to reshape British society in subtle but significant ways. Pre-war class distinctions, though certainly not eliminated, were somewhat blurred by the common threat. The visible contributions of working-class communities to civil defense and war production garnered new respect, while the universal experience of rationing and risk created a framework for discussing more egalitarian post-war policies. Political scientists have noted that support for the welfare state and National Health Service after the war drew moral authority in part from the shared sacrifices of the Blitz period. The bombing also accelerated social changes already underway before the war. Women's employment in traditionally male sectors created new expectations about female capability and economic participation. The evacuation of children from urban areas exposed many middle-class host families to the realities of working-class childhood poverty and malnutrition, contributing to broader support for social welfare measures. The expanded role of the state in organizing civilian defense and maintaining essential services legitimized greater government intervention in economic and social spheres. These transformations did not occur without tension. Conservative elements in British society expressed concern about the loosening of traditional moral constraints during wartime, particularly regarding sexual behavior and alcohol consumption. The blackout, which made nighttime policing difficult, was associated in some minds with moral as well as literal darkness. Church leaders and moral reformers warned about the spiritual dangers of the crisis atmosphere, while government officials privately worried about venereal disease rates and khaki fever, the attraction of young women to men in uniform. Reports from the Home Intelligence Division monitoring civilian morale revealed complex and sometimes contradictory trends. While national resolve remained generally strong, frustration with specific aspects of the government's civil defense preparation occasionally erupted into public criticism. The early inadequacy of public shelters, inequities in the distribution of civil defense resources, and perceived inefficiencies in the emergency response system all generated friction. These criticisms were often framed not as challenges to the war effort itself, but rather as demands that the shared sacrifice be properly supported and equitably distributed. Working-class communities in heavily bombed areas sometimes expressed resentment that their suffering received inadequate acknowledgement or assistance. When Queen Elizabeth famously declared after Buckingham Palace was bombed, "I'm glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Some East Enders privately noted that the royal family still had a palace to retreat to, unlike families rendered completely homeless. These undercurrents of class tension were generally muted in public discourse, but emerged clearly in oral histories and contemporary diaries. The government, sensitive to these potential friction points, adjusted policies in response to civilian feedback and needs. The quality and quantity of public shelters improved markedly over the first months of the Blitz. The Shelter Code established minimum standards for public shelter conditions, including sanitation, bedding, and ventilation. Rest centers for bombing victims were upgraded, and the emergency rehousing system became more efficient. These responsive policy adjustments helped maintain the crucial social contract between citizens enduring bombing and the government asking for their continued sacrifice. Media played a complex role in shaping public understanding of the bombing campaign. Newspapers operated under censorship that prohibited reporting information that might aid enemy targeting or damage morale. Specific bombing locations were typically not identified, casualties were rarely quantified precisely, and photographs of dead bodies were not published. Yet, within these constraints, the press developed a distinctive approach to reporting the Blitz, emphasizing civilian courage, community solidarity, and the continuity of everyday life amid destruction. The BBC, which had established itself as a trusted source of information, provided crucial updates and civil defense information. Radio announcers like Alvar Liddell and Bruce Belfrage became familiar voices of calm, the latter famously continuing to read the news after a bomb struck Broadcasting House. The filmmaker Humphrey Jennings documented the Blitz in powerful shorts like London Can Take It and Fires Were Started, creating a visual record that both reflected and helped construct the narrative of British resilience. This media portrayal, while censored and curated, was not simply propaganda disconnected from reality. It reflected genuine aspects of civilian response while emphasizing the most positive elements. Richard Titmuss, the social researcher who later wrote the official history of Britain's civil defense, observed, "The myth of the Blitz, the story of civilian courage, unity, and resilience, was powerful precisely because it contained substantial truth, even if it was not the whole truth. It was a selective but not fundamentally false representation of a complex reality." As the intensive bombing of London began to subside in mid-1941, with Hitler's focus shifting to Operation Barbarossa and the Eastern Front, the experience of the Blitz became immediately incorporated into national mythology. Even before the bombing had fully ended, films, books, and songs were creating a particular narrative about the civilian experience, one that emphasized stoicism, humor in adversity, and cross-class solidarity. This narrative served both morale and political purposes, unifying the nation for the continuing war effort and establishing a foundational story for post-war Britain. The actual experience, as we have seen, was more nuanced than this emerging mythology suggested. Fear coexisted with courage, class tensions persisted alongside solidarity, and the psychological toll was often concealed beneath the celebrated stiff upper lip. Yet the shared ordeal did create genuine bonds across previous social divisions and demonstrated collective capabilities that would influence post-war expectations about what British society could achieve. The provincial cities that experienced their own versions of the Blitz developed distinctive local narratives of endurance, often incorporated into regional identities that persist to this day. Coventry, whose medieval cathedral was destroyed in November 1940, became particularly symbolic, its name temporarily entering the German language as a verb, koventrieren, to completely destroy a city. The deliberate preservation of the cathedral ruins and the construction of a new cathedral alongside them created a powerful physical representation of destruction and renewal that still draws visitors from around the world. Liverpool, which suffered the highest provincial death toll, with nearly 4,000 civilians killed, developed its own Blitz mythology centered around the port city's crucial role in maintaining Atlantic supply lines despite the bombing. The collective memory of these raids became incorporated into Liverpudlian identity, with local historians noting how the experience reinforced the city's sense of itself as tough, resilient, and somewhat separate from the rest of England. For Plymouth, a key naval base that lost its entire city center, the Blitz created the opportunity for radical urban redesign in the post-war period. The plan for Plymouth, developed by urban planner Patrick Abercrombie, became one of the most ambitious reconstruction schemes in Britain, reimagining the city around modernist principles. Similar reconstruction debates occurred in all heavily bombed cities, with the destruction paradoxically opening possibilities for addressing pre-war problems of slum housing, poor sanitation, and industrial pollution. As the war progressed, the experience of the Blitz took on new significance in light of Allied bombing of German cities. British civilians who had endured the Luftwaffe's attacks now contemplated the mirror image, German women and children sheltering from RAF bombs. Reaction to this parallel varied widely. Some expressed straightforward support for retaliation, while others, particularly religious leaders and peace activists, raised moral concerns about targeting civilian populations regardless of nationality. Vera Brittain, whose pacifism had been shaped by her experiences as a nurse in the First World War, wrote a controversial pamphlet in 1944 titled Seed of Chaos, questioning the morality and strategy of area bombing. She faced significant public backlash, illustrating the complexity of British attitudes toward the bombing war. For most Britons, however, the Allied bombing campaign was seen as a necessary part of defeating Nazi Germany, even if it involved inflicting the same suffering they had endured. The legacy of the Blitz extended far beyond the war years. In practical terms, the bombing created the conditions for massive urban renewal in the post-war period. The destruction of approximately 2 million homes nationwide necessitated an unprecedented housing construction program, while damaged industrial and commercial infrastructure required extensive rebuilding. The Housing Act of 1946 and the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 provided the legislative framework for this reconstruction, with an emphasis on planned development, improved housing standards, and better public amenities. The social policies of the post-war labor government, particularly the establishment of the National Health Service in 1948, drew moral authority from the shared experience of the Blitz. The Beveridge Report of 1942, which laid the groundwork for the welfare state, explicitly referenced the war as creating both the necessity and opportunity for addressing what Beveridge called the 5 giants of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. The notion that citizens who had endured bombing deserved better social provision in peacetime became a powerful political argument. For individuals who lived through the Blitz, the psychological impact often lingered long after the physical damage had been repaired. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress suggests that many survivors would have experienced long-term effects, though these were rarely discussed openly in the immediate post-war period. The cultural expectation to carry on and not dwell on past hardships limited opportunities for processing traumatic experiences. Only decades later, as the concept of PTSD became more widely recognized, did some Blitz survivors begin to contextualize their experiences within this framework. Dorothy Hughes, interviewed for an oral history project out in the 1990s, reflected on this delayed recognition. For years, I couldn't bear sudden loud noises. Thunderstorms sent me into a complete panic. I'd find myself back in that shelter, hearing the bombs coming down. But you didn't talk about such things then. Everyone had been through it, hadn't they? You were expected to put it behind you and get on with life. It wasn't until I read about trauma in the newspaper, this was the 1980s, mind you, that I realized what had happened to me had a name. The cultural memory of the Blitz has evolved over the decades, serving different purposes at different times. In the immediate post-war period, it functioned as a unifying national narrative and a moral justification for domestic reforms. During the Cold War, it provided a historical template for civil defense planning against nuclear attack, though the comparison was problematic given the vastly greater destructive power of nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, as the generation that had experienced the war began to age, a wave of Blitz commemoration and documentation emerged, preserving personal accounts before they were lost. More recently, the concept of Blitz spirit has been invoked during various national crises, from terrorist attacks to the COVID-19 pandemic. These invocations have sometimes been criticized as oversimplifying both the historical experience and contemporary challenges. Yet they speak to the enduring power of the Blitz in British collective memory. The phrase "keep calm and carry on," originally a 1939 poster design that was never widely distributed during the war, has become a globally recognized symbol of British stoicism, reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to T-shirts. Historians and social scientists continue to examine the Blitz experience, finding new perspectives and questioning established narratives. Recent scholarship is focused on previously marginalized experiences, those of colonial subjects in Britain during the bombing, the specific impacts on women, and variations in experience across regions and social classes. These studies have enriched our understanding without fundamentally undermining the core historical significance of civilian endurance under bombardment. For modern visitors to British cities, physical reminders of the Blitz remain visible if one knows where to look. Gaps in otherwise consistent Victorian terraces, architectural juxtapositions where post-war rebuilding sits alongside surviving pre-war structures, and the occasional preserved bomb site converted to memorial gardens all testify to the enduring impact of those 9 months of intensive bombing. More formal commemorations exist in museums and memorials, while local history projects in formerly bombed areas have documented the experiences of specific communities and neighborhoods. Perhaps most significantly, the Blitz has become a defining chapter in Britain's national story, a moment when civilians found themselves on the front lines of a world war and demonstrated a resilience that would help define British identity in the post-war world. The reality, as we have explored, was more complex than the myth, encompassing fear alongside courage, class tensions alongside solidarity, and suffering alongside endurance. Yet the essential historical truth remains. Ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances and, collectively, survived to rebuild their cities and society. In the words of Harold Nicholson, writing in his diary in May 1941, as the main Blitz period drew to a close, "What will remain in history is not the inconvenience, the discomfort, the anxiety, or even the casualties, terrible as they have been. What will remain is the behavior of our people, calm, determined, unruffled, helping each other without distinction of class." If civilization survives, historians will record this as one of the most magnificent examples of collective courage in human experience. The legacy of the Blitz continues to resonate through British society and beyond. It stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of deliberate terror, to the capacity of communities to adapt and endure through the darkest of circumstances, and to the complex interplay between individual fear and collective courage that emerges in moments of existential threat. In studying this history, we gain insight not only into a specific historical moment, but into the broader human capacity to face seemingly insurmountable challenges and emerge changed but undefeated on the other side.